Like Josh said, we'll go ahead and roll into the next session. And good afternoon. I'm pleased to introduce Mike Truitt as our 2021 Edgar J. Poth Memorial Lecturer. Mike completed his medical training at UT Houston, University of Colorado, and then University of Texas Southwestern, and has subsequently spent his entire professional career at Methodist Dallas. While being at Methodist Dallas, Mike has served as the trauma medical director and was crucial in establishing their surgical critical care fellowship. Mike has also served as the president of the North Texas chapter of the American College of Surgeons and is currently a governor of the American College of Surgeons. I'm pleased to call Mike a close friend, and I'm happy to say that our friendship was really established through the Southwestern Surgical Congress. So, Mike.
Thank you so much for taking some time out today. It's hard to compete with Hawaii, that's for sure. We'll do our best to entertain you along the way. I want to begin, though, by just talking a little bit about the namesake of this lectureship, Edgar Poth. He was born in Seguin, Texas. He had lots of impressive degrees, a BS, a master's, a PhD, and an MD. He had a tenure at both Hopkins and Stanford, and was on faculty at UTMB and Galveston for over 40 years. During that time, he was the director of surgical research. He had over 160 scientific papers. And then he was also the 15th president of the Southwest Surgical Congress. So I'm honored to be able to deliver this lecture today. I will say if Rob said he's the longest running president of the Southwest Surgical, I guess I'm the longest running Poth lecturer. And the reason for that is because we talked about this over 2 years ago. And I was honored when he asked, but I have to tell you, having 2 years to think about a topic is actually somewhat of a beating. Just because typically when we're giving talks, you have a data set to discuss. You're going to talk about parathyroids in elderly patients. And this being such an open range topic actually made it relatively difficult. So this picture is actually Rob. I'm to the right. I cut myself out because I looked foolish. But we were at a Rockets game in Houston. And so our friendship definitely developed at the Southwest Surgical. And then we found that we had other kind of common interests like the Rockets. And so I would go down to Houston a couple of times to go watch playoff games with Rob. And as it turned out, we were 2 for 2, actually. The Clippers won 1 year, and I can't remember who we played the other year, but won both of those games. So again, 2 years to think about the topic, relatively open-ended. These are some of the things I considered: rib fractures, geriatric trauma. You heard a little bit about that this morning from Dr. Mangrum and from our place at Methodist. Delirium, surgical education. Nobody wants to hear me say why I think my residency is better than your residency. Robotic surgery and acute care is a topic that actually Dr. Mangrum is going to talk about tomorrow. So that took that off my list. And then PTSD and burnout. And I looked at these and I said, even I don't want to hear some of these. Okay. So I really wanted to pick a topic for the moment. I wasn't sure if it was going to be appropriate or not. But then as soon as I got here, I saw this. What is this? Yeah. And like, where is this? Do you guys know? Well, you know. Yeah, in Swan Court. So I literally had walked in, I checked into my room. I tried to check in, I didn't have a room. And then I walked over here and was gonna try to get out to the pool bar, because that's what one does when you don't have a room. You go to the pool bar and then you grab some lunch. And literally 90 seconds after arriving, this little guy, I crossed his path. And so the title of this talk is, Can This Black Swan Lay Golden Eggs? There's one black swan out there. And raise your hand if you're familiar with the idea of the term of black, not the animal. This isn't going to be a zoology lecture, but raise your hand if you're familiar with the concept of a black swan as an event. Okay, good. I'm actually glad most of you are not. So what is a black swan then? It's actually familiarized by this guy, Nassim Taleb, in his book 2007 called The Black Swan. There was a movie of similar, this is not that, okay? So it's not going to be a zoology lecture, it's not going to be a movie talk, but it is going to talk about this term that Taleb used to really classify these unforeseen events. Okay, so that he coined this term to really describe an unforeseen event that was highly consequential, that had a disproportionate impact on the world from that point in the future. And it was interesting because they were explainable. And I use the word explainable in air quotes because the only reason it's explainable is because we trick ourselves into thinking, oh, we just missed the cues. The data was there, we just didn't see it. And so there's huge kind of cataclysmic event that occurs. We look back because our brains want to resolve this kind of uncertainty. They want to resolve chaos, right? We want everything to be ordered and predictable. And when the world isn't ordered and predictable, we convince ourselves that it is even when it isn't. So he was this really interesting guy from Lebanon. He was a quant. He was an options trader at one point, and really he's kind of settled in as a risk analyst. But he really was one of the first to propose this idea, or the term at least, of black swans. Well, why do they matter? Again, they're the driving force of radical change on planet Earth. Okay, and so these events, and obviously September 11th is the picture there. After September 11th, from that point on, up until even the last week, we underwent a very different path as a country. In a lot of ways, that was really good. In some ways, maybe it wasn't as good. I'm not really here to talk about the politics of that or even the outcomes. Okay, but you can see now that September 11th was a driving force of radical change. And as the world becomes more interconnected, these events are becoming more consequential. There's this idea that as we get bigger and as everything's kind of interdependent on each other, that might actually be safer. We're talking about it from a monetary policy. Well, if we have one kind of currency, well, then as it's distributed over many governments or many continents, that's safe. And Taleb would actually say that interdependence is actually more risky, because instead of being siloed, instead of having events affecting one thing, one country or one continent, it affects kind of all of them at the same time. So black swans are important because they're not accounted for in standard modeling. So again, he was a quant, he was an options trader. His whole idea was kind of looking at the most extreme of things. And when we talk about things like floods, what do we talk about? We talk about 50-year floods, 100-year floods. That's like when we get to the 100-year flood, you're like, okay, you've really covered your bases as an insurance company or as an options person. And his point here is not, what matters is not how often you're right, but how large your cumulative errors are. And so most risk analysts look at how often they're right. They're like, okay, I'm going to be right 98.8% of the time or 99.8% of the time. But if that 0.2% of the time you're wrong is all that matters, then you haven't done your job. And this is kind of, he gets on a soapbox. He's an interesting guy, I have to say. But he gets on his soapbox kind of talking about how basically, these are things that we can't even conceive of, and so they can't be planned for. In the midst of these black swans, expert advice is often useless. And so how does an expert typically gain favor in terms of being able to speak on an event? How did we as surgeons, how are we able to speak about surgery? We have experience, right? And the whole point of a black swan event is that no one has experience in that event. That's what makes it by definition a black swan event. It was unforeseen. It hasn't been experienced before. And so expert advice ends up becoming useless, but doesn't keep experts from talking, doesn't keep people from thinking they know what's going to happen or how to deal with something. And again, September 11th is probably a good example of this. Everybody within days said, well, this is what we need to do. Well, nobody could predict what was going to happen over the next 20 years in Afghanistan, right? With $2 trillion and what the end outcome of that was going to be. It doesn't mean you don't act. It just means that you have to know that there is no such thing as an expert in those circumstances. But what are the causes then? So we've defined what a black swan is. We said why they matter. And so let's talk about what are the causes. And I'm going to tell you what we believe and that causes black swans or these kind of significant events. Then I'm going to tell you what actually causes them. We believe that history is an inevitable march of sequential and logical events. A happens, and then B happens, and then C happens, and then D happens. And again, our mind kind of works through this and wants it to all be linear and to be pretty and kind of with a bow on top. And this really puts us up to be, sets us up to be subjected to something called the narrative fallacy. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of the narrative fallacy. So the narrative fallacy basically says, my residents are raising their hands because I talk about it in conference a lot. So the narrative fallacy basically says that your brain wants the story to sound good. And it's willing to sacrifice the truthfulness or the veracity of whatever it is you're describing as long as it sounds good. And if it doesn't sound good, even if it's true, your brain doesn't like it, okay? And there's a good example of this. So Steve Jobs, right? Stories that make sense. So the story, if you look at some of the biographies on him, he says, oh, he was successful because he was abandoned by his parents. And this led to him constantly looking for success and affirmation. And he came out before his death and actually he's like, this is not true at all. Like, I just was motivated internally. My parents like, yes, I was disappointed that my parents didn't raise me and that I didn't have them in my life, but that had very little to do with my success. But the story, right, An athlete, oh, Michael Jordan gets cut from his high school basketball team, and that's why he becomes Michael Jordan, right? No, he became Michael Jordan because he was 6'10", and because he could shoot, and he could jump, and he worked harder than everybody else, right? And so we love this story. We love this narrative fallacy. In medicine too, the patient dies. Immediately, we want to know, well, why did the patient die? And it's easy for us to think, oh, he had an MI, had a PE, and then the postmortem comes back, anastomotic leak, right? And so it's easy for us in our minds to want to make sense of these things. And we also want the story that sounds best to us, okay? And that's important because the story that sounds good to me may not be the same as the story that sounds good to you. And we may both be wrong. And so we have to get away from this idea that things have to make sense, because most of this world doesn't make sense, right? So the truth is that most black swans are caused by random and multifactorial events that we don't really understand how they work together. And we need to be comfortable with that, because that's the way that we're going to be most effective in dealing with them. So instead of history being an inevitable march of sequential and logical events of A plus B plus C plus D, history is actually a chaotic mishmash of influences and people. And how all those things interact together is well beyond our ability to understand, and certainly beyond our ability to predict. So the narrative fallacy leads us to believe that we understand the world better than we actually do. And that sets us up for unnecessary or unforced errors. All right, so now I've had whatever, 5-7 minutes of intro. Now I'm going to tell you what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about, is COVID a black swan? But this isn't going to be a talk about why COVID is bad. This is going to be a talk about the good things that come from COVID. And I'm going to say right now, I didn't mention COVID in the title because I thought the room would be even more empty than it is right now if I was talking about COVID. I probably would have stayed by the pool, okay? So the question of whether or not it's a black swan, I think it's a solid maybe. Okay, I'm going to tell you that from the beginning. It really just depends on how you define black swan. And there's black swans, and the reason that they use that term was because back in the 1700s, Europeans believed that there were only white swans. So that's all they'd ever been exposed to. And as they explored the world, they came across this black swan, and they kind of brought this idea that just because you haven't seen it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, okay? And that's COVID, that's September 11th, that's all these other things. Okay, so solid maybe on whether COVID is a black swan, because number one, it was predicted. Remember I said earlier that they're supposed to be kind of unfathomable, right? Well, clearly was predicted by lots of people. So that part kind of automatically puts it in non-black swan territory. But it certainly was underestimated and poorly managed by everyone. So this fits into that experts category that I talked about earlier, where during a black swan or some cataclysmic event, there really are no experts because the people that are alive have not really experienced that, and they haven't learned from that experience on how to manage it better the next time. Was it highly consequential, and was it a driving force of change? Clearly. So the prediction here is that the net effect of COVID is actually going to be positive. So we're hearing lots of horrible things. And I just want to make sure I'm going to say up front, I'm not trying to mitigate any of the negatives that we've been through for the last 18 months, okay? But I do want to kind of take a 30,000-foot view and say, I think that in the years to come, and maybe even the year to come, that the net effect is actually going to be positive in every way, okay? I don't know that, but I'm optimistic. And again, I don't want to be talking about a talk about uncertainty and sound overly confident. The whole point of this talk is these things are hard to know, right? But I do have some data behind me that I think helps us feel better about this idea. So let's talk about the golden eggs that are coming as a result of COVID. I'm going to start with the soft stuff. So it's ironic that one infectious disease could help us decrease the incidence of another infectious disease, right? And so we all know that C. diff has decreased significantly. There's a lot of reasons for that. Patients run in the hospitals, elective surgery decreased. But the patients that were in the hospital were getting a lot of antibiotics. I don't know about your COVID unit, but the prophylactic antibiotics, the pneumonia antibiotics were everywhere, okay? And that was partly because people, again, there were no experts. People were trying to figure out how to best manage this disease. But if you look at the incidence of C. diff over 2020 to 2021, it actually decreased by 50%. And again, that was despite the increased use of antibiotics. And so COVID did something that no one or nothing else ever has. It's convinced healthcare workers to wash our hands. Flu went from 30 million cases a year in kind of 2019. It's 30 to 37 million, depending on who you believe or who you read, to 2000. Clearly, the number is higher than that. Again, it had to do with the fact that people were locked down, the elderly people were not interacting, And so there's lots of variables that go into this. RSV had a 98% reduction. It's bounced back here recently. It's just kind of delayed that RSV season. So you have to ask the question of, are these reproducible out of a global shutdown? And clearly the answer is no. But I'm not necessarily looking to decrease flu by 29,998,000 cases. But there are a framework here now to say, like, this is something that we certainly could get a better handle on than what we've done in the past. So things like masks, hand hygiene, and social distancing have benefits beyond COVID. All right, so those are the soft targets. We got C. diff, we got RSV, flu. But let's talk about vaccine technology. The amount of money that was dumped into this R&D of not just mRNA vaccines, but kind of everything that's been going on with COVID is going to pay dividends, is already paying dividends. So let's talk briefly about the benefits of mRNA. These vaccines are great because the rapidity of development. If you look at an attenuated or a live attenuated vaccine, it takes months or years to bring to market. And with their mRNA vaccine, you really can create a new vaccine based on the messenger, identify the protein, identify the mRNA, and kind of plug and play technology within the delivery vehicle. And these vaccines can be developed in the future in weeks as opposed to months and years. It's non-infectious for patients that have to worry about an attenuated virus. It's been able to generate a robust immune response. Now, clearly, the number of doses, the timing between doses, is there a difference between one company's mRNA vaccine versus another, is still being worked out. But if you're asking, are these things effective? Is the technology effective and able to do it? The answer is clearly yes. They're much more scalable. And so you can take this, and we've seen this within the pandemic, the number of doses that can go from 0 to millions of doses is the benefit of it being cell-free. So there's no growth needed in a lab, which was necessary with previous vaccine technologies. Again, it's a quick pivot for mutations because you just need the mRNA. You actually don't even need the virus. You just need the mRNA sequence, right? So lots of these vaccines that we're using now, they never saw the virus. They never sequenced the virus themselves. It was given to them, sometimes in one case by the Chinese, and then sequenced from there. Okay, so the vaccine never, the virus never even had to be in the hands of the people who were subsequently making the vaccine. And in a, I think, surprising turn of events, this advanced technology is also cheaper. Okay, so you've got rapidity of development, robust immune response, scalable, and cheaper. So let's talk about some therapeutics on the horizon as a result of the advancement of this technology. This is one of the things that I'm most excited about, a universal flu vaccine. So right now, when do they have to pick the strains of flu that we're going to plan for the next year? Anybody know? How far ahead of flu season? It's about 6 or 8 months, okay? Because of the time it takes to make a traditional flu vaccine, they have to predict well into the future. Sometimes it's 10 months. And so they really have no window into what's actually going to be happening 9 months from now. With these vaccines, again, you could actually pick strains closer to flu season. You could actually pick them like a month or two. So you could actually see in certain parts of the world which strains are already becoming more prevalent. So it'll take some of the guess games out of the universal flu vaccine. It also can be multi-antigen capable. So you could actually take 4 or 5 or 6 of those most common or most likely strains and put them all in one vaccine, which has proven to be much more difficult with the traditional flu vaccine. And so that looks to increase the efficacy of that vaccine from 50% upwards of 80%. I think that's exciting. When you look at the number of people that get the flu every year, the populations that are at risk, that alone could make the net of all of this come out positive in the long run. There's similar therapeutics looking at RSV, at HSV2, and HIV. They're in some of them are in phase 1, 2, and 3 trials. But another one of the things that I think the surgical oncologists in the room have to be excited about is this idea of a personalized cancer vaccine. I've said for years in conference, I'm like, I don't understand. Why can't they just find a protein on the cancer that's not on any of the other cells and then direct the immune response to it? And that's how you know I'm not a basic science researcher, right? Because it's not simple. But that's basically what they're doing. So at least for now, surgical excision is still required. You take the specimen out, you identify the unique protein on the cancer cell, you sequence that protein, and then you create the vaccine. And now you use surgical excision in concert with this vaccine, which augments the immune response in concert with things like checkpoint inhibitors. And this is being used particularly in melanoma, pancreatic cancer, and some others with really pretty impressive results. And there's some data that shows that these immune response, the memory surveillance of these tumor cells goes on for years, 6, 8, 10 years. Okay, so as the tumor begins to grow back, the immune system says, hey, I know you, you're not supposed to be here, and takes it out before you even see evidence of a recurrence. So this has the potential to revolutionize oncology, and certainly surgical oncology. So the R&D that's been invested in these vaccines, and again, predating COVID, but really amplified and accelerated in recent months and years, is really going to have a significant impact going forward. What about telemedicine? How many years have we been talking about and hearing about telemedicine? I mean, it's been mired in bureaucracy for 10 years. Raise your hand if you use telemedicine at all now. I mean, that's actually more of you than I thought. That's amazing. Now, did you do it? Raise your hand if you used it before COVID at the same that you use it now. All right, none of you basically, or one of you. Okay, so this is a significant embrace. And this, for surgery, this is like it's a 3 out of 10 or a 4 out of 10 maybe. But for primary care, this is a 12 out of 10, right? And so the regulations and technical specs that were, argued over and discussed for years have finally been codified. What about license reciprocity? Out of nowhere, in a matter of 2 weeks, all of a sudden we had medical licensure reciprocity for telemedicine. That was a sticking point for years. And so there's actually some discussion this may lead to a national medical license. And if we don't end up with a national medical license out as a result of all of this, we did something wrong. It's going to revolutionize access to care. Think about the homebound patient, the rural patient. And again, this has some surgical relevance as well. Post-op, I don't think first-time H&Ps are great for this. Okay, like patient comes in, you're establishing a relationship, but follow-up visits, certainly immediate post-op visits, basic things like appies and choles, things that are going to be straightforward. The efficiency gained both for the patient and for the physician blows my mind a little bit. So this is the thing that surprised me. I thought, oh man, it's going to be a hassle. Everything technology is a hassle. Epic's a hassle. Cerner's a hassle. This is going to be a hassle. This actually is not a hassle. This actually saves time for you and the patient because they don't have to travel. They don't have to come sit in your waiting room. They're not sitting out there with 10 other people getting COVID or, whatever else, the flu or whatever else is going around. And so telemedicine is another one of those things that by itself, I think could ultimately be one of the golden eggs that makes COVID kind of, I don't want to say worthwhile, but at least lessens the blow. And the last was remuneration. So there, at least temporarily, there's been parity between telemedicine and in-person visits. Again, I think our key right now is to not let these gains that have been made, these bureaucracy that was overnight melted away. Our goal now has to be to not allow that to happen again, and to take that momentum and build on it rather than losing it. And the next thing that I talk about is increased collaboration. I call this telemedicine for us, okay? I'm not talking about physician visits, but I'm talking about cohorting together. I'm talking about national COVID WhatsApp groups. I'm talking about acute care WhatsApp groups or text strings. And this happened really kind of overnight, where we were discussing locally, nationally, and internationally. We were talking with the ICU doctors in Italy when they were going through their surge. We were talking with friends in China. We had some surgeons come stay with us years ago. We were able to touch base with them and kind of get an idea of what they were doing, what was working, what they were worried about before it had even kind of come to us. We were talking about PPE and safety. And this is a great example of, we were trying to figure out how we were going to get masks because the hospitals, didn't have access to them. So we got online and we all kind of had our own sources. I had a friend who was a missionary in Qatar, but had lived in China for a long time. And his best friend owned an N95 factory, a KN95 factory. And so all of a sudden there was this huge amount of PPE that was available to people, and we were able to distribute it and get it out to the right people. Other people found masks, that were in short supply, and we were able to discuss, where to get those from and how to do it. We were able to discuss the diagnosis. This actually was probably one of the best things. We just were able to laugh a little bit. So these things would come out. We'd be in the midst of talking about really terrible things. When New York was going through their surge, Sheldon was kind of, we were talking about what was going on there, but then we would be able to laugh a little bit. Dr. Hassan Alam, when he was at Michigan, would say, hey, this is kind of our current up-to-date ICU COVID treatment, kind of the one pager. And then these got updated with data, these got updated with experience kind of constantly. And so instead of waiting for this to come out in a and a TED talk or certainly a paper manuscript, we're able to get these kind of in real time. And then again, the sense of humor and kind of the stress relief was probably maybe even one of the most beneficial things. So here we had large groups of physicians talking in real time about the issues of the day and of the minute. You know, there's Facebook groups like I don't know if the people, certainly people here are part of the International Hernia Consortium or the robotic surgery collaboration, those sorts of things. And those are great, but this really became a day-to-day, minute-to-minute with 50 or 75 close friends where we could discuss really anything. And the good news is this is really no longer about COVID. I say that we still discuss it, but I bet it's 20% of the time. And now we're talking about the future of acute care surgery. We're talking about how to define FTEs. We're talking about staffing models. We're talking about the neurocritical care boards. We're talking about Medicare cuts. We're talking about difficult cases. And so this is something that kind of, again, began in the era of COVID, but really is blossoming in the time after. What about surgical education? So for 2 years, I kid you not, my program coordinator tried to get me to consider doing a Zoom didactic, to add an option for people that weren't there. And I will say there's parts of it that I don't love because some of my faculty now would rather Zoom in than come in person. So everything has a pro and a con. But I will say she was right because some of the opportunities that we have for away rotations when a resident can't see our conference or couldn't come, now then they have that opportunity. And that's good for us because it helps us standardize our curriculum. And one of the things that I think that we've done well at Methodist over the years is we've really standardized the stuff that we teach to all of the residents. They end up with basically the same education. And as we've increased away rotations, I worried that we would have less consistency across the spectrum. From the residents' perspective, it helps them minimize the feelings of kind of being gone. So again, they go to away rotations, they feel like they're not a part of the team. But if they just see your face and laugh with you and you call on them and all of a sudden that they kind of have that oh, that's my surgical family. And that has actually paid more dividends than I would have imagined. The QE and CE. The QE was a qualified success, I would say, the first time around, and it's gone back to the Pearson testing centers. I suspect that will continue to evolve, but the CE was an unqualified success. I haven't met a person that didn't not only like, but love, and I'm talking about examiner and examinee, because it was less stressful for the examinee. You're in your study, you're in your living room, as opposed to a hotel room. They didn't have to worry about travel. So you didn't have to worry about, oh, my flight's late, or I got canceled, or that's $800 for a flight to this particular city at this particular time. So there were cost and time savings. And then it was less intimidating. So you're not walking into a hotel room with strangers. And I won't read this quote, but you could see that when she said this out loud, it really resonated with me. What about virtual resident and fellowship interviews? This is something else that I think really was not on my radar to the point at which it should have been. And that was the need for equity in looking at these interviews. Okay, and so costs of interviews are reasons. I've had some research fellows over the years, and they go to apply, and I'm like, okay, how many programs did you apply to? Well, I only applied to like 20. Hey, what do you mean? Like you need to cast the widest net possible to make sure that we help get you where you're trying to go. Well, but it was expensive, and I didn't have and in the grand scheme of things, it's $2,000 versus your career, right? But at that moment in time, that $2,000 was everything to them. And so we forget sometimes as attendings that some people grew up differently and didn't have access to the same resources that we have. And so virtual resident and fellowship interviews have made that more equitable. It is a time and money saver. I was told as a program director, it's easier to do the resident interviews virtually. I will say it's not perfect. And if you look at the APDS listserv, the jury's out. It's about 50% love it, about 50% hate it. But my suspicion is that we're going to have some hybrid of this going forward that we would have probably never gotten to, or certainly not in the same time frame without COVID kind of pushing our hand. National meetings, this meeting in particular, and the ACS too, in-person and streaming hybrid approach is here to stay. That technology has been in place for years, but we needed something to make that push us over the edge and to give us that nudge. Time and place shifting, we've been doing it with TV shows and TiVo. I had a TiVo in 1998. Okay, I had one of the first TiVos, the coolest gift I ever got. My father-in-law gave it to me. I was like, what is this TiVo thing? I don't need this. And then like a week later, I was like, I can't live without it, right? And now DVRs are commonplace. We're doing that now for surgical education. And so that means that we're increasing access. It means that that we are getting cutting edge teaching to more people in more places. And that's going to be good for us, and it's going to be good for our patients. What about this cultural shift? So those are kind of some of the medical things, right? Surgical education, infectious disease, vaccine technology. I'm going to talk a little bit more now globally and not be so provincial in my scope. So what about the cultural shift on work and time off? So you've seen headlines like this over and over again where employees are quitting instead of giving up working from home. They're living in different places. They've moved. They're out. When I went to Colorado a year ago, every single person I met was a business person who decided they wanted to live in Colorado because they could do their job from Vail. It was crazy. And so this is has some legs to it, right? They realize they don't have to live in New York City. They don't have to live in San Francisco. And the cost of living and the quality of living is dramatically different. So people are changing the way that they approach work. And it's not just the business world, so are we. This is a tweet recently that talks about the great resignation and why millions of workers are quitting their jobs. And I see this in medicine, not necessarily the quitting, but certainly people are tired and they're not willing to put up with some of the things that they were willing to put up with in the past. And they're certainly considering their happiness instead of productivity. They're certainly more focused on relationships over material things and achievements. I was talking with Alicia yesterday, and she's like, COVID's been the best thing ever for my family. And I was like, I know not everybody shares that. Like, it's been harder for some people than others. But it was a resounding chorus of people that have said, hey, my relationships with my significant other, with my kids, with whatever, is better than it's ever been. And so I think that's an opportunity that really, for many people in this room, it only comes when somebody makes you do that, right? You just get so caught up in your habit loops. We get so caught up in our routines that I'll talk about a little later. And it's very hard to break those. What about hospital and organizational culture? They're looking at bonus retentions for nurses, things that should have been done in the past. You can learn a lot about how an organization values people right now, and really in the last 12 months, but even right now. If they couldn't get you PPE and they weren't there, the administration wasn't there helping you, if they stayed home while you were in the trenches, if they were the first people to stand in front of a TV camera or a microphone while the pulmonary critical care docs or the surgical critical care docs or the nurses or NPs or PAs were doing all the hard work of taking care of these patients, then you know where you stand. And it doesn't mean it can't change, but at least it knows right now where you stand. Time off. And so this is actually a really good book. It's called People Over Profit. If you haven't read it, I recommend it. It kind of speaks a little bit to some of the topics that we've been discussing here. Speaking of time off, I'll tell you something that I did in July that I never thought I would do. I took a month off. I took a month off. I still sounds funny when I say it. Before that, I had never taken for pure vacation more than a week. Okay, I'd spent lots of time traveling for work and doing kids things and all these, but I'd never taken more than about 7 days. And most years, I had my regular vacation that I used about 25% of. Again, I traveled for work, I was gone, those sorts of things. But in terms of like vacation, I used about 25% of it. And so during COVID, they increased our cap to where you could accrue vacation time. And I thought, man, that was really nice. And then we couldn't take vacation, so it's nice for them to, they didn't want us to lose it. But then they promptly said, hey, you've got to use it by this certain date, or then you lose it again. So I went to my DIO and said, hey, what do you think? And he said, I think you ought to take some time off. I said, what do you think? We think we have taken a month off. And I just kind of thought he would laugh, if I'm honest with you. And he was like, really good idea. And so we did that. I cleared it with my program coordinator, my partners, the residents, kind of everybody was kind of in on it. And in pretty short order, I decided to take the month of July off. And it's not something that I probably would have never considered and may not have had the opportunity to do in the pre-COVID times. And I would say this is something that after being on the back end of that, this is something that we should normalize. It doesn't need to, I'm not saying like you work a year and take a month off. I'm not advocating for overly cushy surgery schedules. Okay, that's not my life. But I would advocate for some thoughtful consideration about, the idea of a sabbatical. The people, when you come back, you're better, the organization's better, and everybody kind of wins. And I would say that to my experience with that myself and with other people, that's really how that works out. So we went to Vail for about 10 days, which we love. We spent some time biking and hiking and river rafting. Went to the British Virgin Islands on a boat. Had some people cook for us and make sure we didn't crash the boat. And we caught fish and we snorkeled and we did all the things that you do in the British Virgin Islands. And just had a really good time. And so one of the books that I read while I was there had a quote that said, "Unless a person takes charge of them, both work and free time are likely to be disappointing." And I thought, that's interesting. Like, I've always kind of taken charge of work, and I've actually taken charge of family stuff too. This is not one of those talks where you're gonna have a dad sitting up and like, man, I wish I'd spent more time with my kids. I always love more time with my kids, but I've done all that. I remember coming back from a European trip, and kind of getting to the airport. My car was pre-packed so that I could, get off the plane, get in the car and drive to my son's camp out. So like I came back early to be able to make sure that I do those sorts of things. And so this is, I've taken charge, I would say, of work. I've taken charge of family. But the thing that I hadn't done was taken charge of my own free time. So one of the take homes for me was free time actually has to be scheduled into your life. We're so busy, so many great opportunities are going to come your way. So many neat things to do are going to be put on your plate that you have to be intentional about free time. And that point escaped me for a very long period of time. And so one of the best parts for COVID for me was kind of stopping and thinking through this. So the best part of COVID for me personally was actually broken habit loops. I had these things that I did every day. I knew when I was getting up. I knew when I was going to bed. I knew when I was going to have the laptop out. I knew when I was going to be working on research. I knew when I was going to be operating. I knew when I was going to be doing resident stuff. And this finally, the destruction of our routines is like my favorite term, because it broke a habit loop that said, hey, this is just what you do every day. And those were good things. These were not bad things. These were all amazing things, amazing opportunities. But I had subjugated myself to my routine of really good things. And so I would say that once COVID kind of broke all those up, because we didn't have baseball, I didn't have volleyball to go to for my daughter, I didn't have a choir concert, I didn't have, elective surgery was significantly decreased. The word is disorienting. It took me a minute. I felt uncomfortable. I felt like probably like maybe what people feel like when they retire. You're like, wait a minute, this is what I usually do. This is how I usually do it. And it was disorienting. But the cessation of superfluous meetings, here's a quick question. What is the only guaranteed output of a meeting? Another meeting. That's right. That's the only thing. Like all you end up doing is having more meetings as a result of them, right? And so the good news, one of the things that COVID has done is that it's helped cease superfluous meetings. And I think we're just at the beginning. It may have actually been worse at the beginning, because with Zoom, I would now be at a baseball game watching my son play baseball, and then also with a Zoom meeting kind of in my earpiece off to the side. I think we're realizing now that, hey, these meetings that need to be done, that we should have, but the superfluous meetings, we're learning how to prune those. There's less work-related travel. And so those are things for me as an adult, but what about my kids? One of the things that I learned about them is when they had a more relaxed schedule, I also had more relaxed kids. So what I was doing, kind of going from one thing to another, changing in the car, like on the way to changing out of my scrubs on my way to the baseball game, sometimes like while driving, don't tell anybody, just because I didn't want to be late when I got there. They had similar kind of fits of over structure and too many things. And so as they had fewer things to do, they seemed to relax and take it all in stride. We started asking, my wife, Jen, who's my wife, and I started asking, do we need to have all these activities? So we were much more intentional about things that we said yes to and things that we said no to. So the good news is, with fewer work and fewer kid things, that allowed some free time for me, right? To do some things that I hadn't done in a long time. All right, so COVID, black swan, white swan, or ruin event. And I would just say, I don't really care what you call it. It doesn't really matter. I don't think it meets the true strict criteria of a black swan, okay? But it doesn't matter. The names are not important. What we need to learn is to pivot from trying to predict these events, because hint, we can't. We can't. That's the whole point. You don't see them coming. They're in your blind spot. They're beyond your standard models. You can't predict them. Taleb, one of his most frustrating things is people bring him on an interview and they're like, hey, tell us what the next 4 black swans are going to be. And he's like, you didn't read the book, or you read it and you didn't understand it, okay? And so we can't predict these things, but we need to focus on systems that can respond, adapt, and thrive when, not if, these sort of events occur. So he's kind of coined this other term in another book that I recommend you read. It's called Anti-Fragile. So he talks about robust and he talks about resilience. And he's like, those are not what we're looking for. We're not looking for resilience. We're not looking for robust systems. We're looking for something called anti-fragile. And I won't go into, it's a long description about what it is, but the short answer is it's a system that is made stronger by using rather than suffering from random events, unpredictable shocks, and volatility. It actually gets stronger during these events. And that's one of the things that I think that we need to continue to learn from, both in medicine and as a country. All right, so last slide. So the golden eggs of our black swan are some of these infectious diseases, vaccine therapeutics, telemedicine, surgical education, and then the societal views on work and time off. There's so many positive things that have and will come from COVID, but it's also an opportunity and an obligation for us to do better next time. These are some pictures from various Southwest Surgicals over the years. I looked for the ones that were most appropriate for posting. So this is my favorite Rob Todd picture when he and Chris Kokenauer. And then this is when I went into a casino and I surprised one of my partners, and I was surprised that I didn't get hit. So thank you for your time. I look forward to having discussions about this offline. Thank you.